What if everything we know about human history is just the surface of a deeper, more intricate truth? For centuries, we've charted the course of our past with confident strokes. The rise and fall of empires, the steady climb from stone tools to silicon chips, the tidy assumption that progress moves in a straight line. But sometimes, buried beneath layers of time and ice, or whispered through nearly forgotten stories, something slips through. A clue, a fracture in the neat timeline, an artifact that should not exist, an expedition that found more than it was meant to. This is not a tale of conspiracies, but of questions too large for easy answers, not of hidden cabals, but of the limits of human certainty. These are the chronicles of explorers, scientists, adventurers, dreamers, who ventured into the unknown and came back with stories no one wanted to believe. Or never came back at all. In the frozen silence of Antarctica, beneath ancient glaciers, a discovery was made that defied all known history. In the endless green of the Amazon, a city older and more complex than any map had dared imagine was glimpsed, and then lost. Across the Gobi Desert, Tibetan plateaus, and the hidden valleys of the Arctic, small bands of seekers stumbled upon fragments of something bigger. Civilizations too advanced for their own technologies no one could explain. Knowledge that seemed to stretch beyond human origin. Official records offer tidy explanations. Mapping missions, cultural exchanges, paleontological digs. Yet behind each innocuous name, these missions found the unexplainable and then disappeared beneath layers of classified silence. This documentary is not about proving anything. It's about listening to the echo of footsteps across forgotten corridors, to voices left out of textbooks, to explorers who dared to write down what they saw, only to have their words buried. Through 14 chapters, we will journey across continents and centuries, tracing the faint outlines of these lost expeditions. Each story begins with a place, an icy ridge, a jungle river, a desert cavern, and ends with a mystery. The explorers are real. Their discoveries were documented, only to vanish from public view. Their accounts are not legends, but fragments of truth overwritten by time, and perhaps by design. We will begin where few ever look, at the bottom of the world. A place so remote, so silent, it seems the past itself could sleep beneath the ice, undisturbed for millennia. In 1946, a military operation known as High Jump set out under the command of Admiral Richard Byrd. Officially, it was a mapping mission. But what they found beneath the Antarctic sky was so extraordinary it would never appear in history books. What if Antarctica isn't just a frozen wasteland, but a sealed vault of humanity's forgotten past? That's where our journey begins. It began with a descent into silence. February 1947. Admiral Richard E. Byrd flew over Antarctica's interior, his aircraft humming against a horizon of endless white. But then, something changed. The instruments faltered. The temperature spiked. And below, where ice should have ruled, there was a valley of warmth, bare rock, and impossible structures. This was Operation High Jump, a massive post-war naval expedition involving thousands of personnel, ships, and aircraft. Publicly, it was about training and testing in extreme conditions. Privately, it was something else. Byrd's personal account, later locked away and only released decades after his death, described the moment they crossed into something unreal, an ice-free pocket of land in the heart of the coldest place on Earth. The valley was not a product of climate. It was heated, not by volcanic vents, but by something inside. Ancient buildings carved with precision stood exposed. No mortar, just massive blocks of stone, joined with such accuracy they looked grown rather than built. Their shapes echoed no known culture, and yet they bore unmistakable intent, design, engineering, purpose. Among the ruins were metallic objects, too advanced to classify. Some seemed to generate localized warmth, resisting the cold in a way no modern material could. There were symbols, too. intricate carvings that blended astronomy, mathematics, and something resembling technical diagrams. Languages unknown, knowledge misplaced. When Byrd returned, the expedition was silenced. The area was declared restricted. Photographs disappeared. Team members were reassigned and forbidden from speaking. His story, when finally made public, read more like science fiction than a debriefing. And yet the gravity in his words was unshakable. Today, satellite imagery shows geometric anomalies beneath the Antarctic ice, precisely where Byrd described. But treaties, restrictions, and international agreements ensure no independent investigations can proceed. A continent that should be open in the name of science remains, curiously, off-limits. What Byrd found was not just an archaeological enigma. It was a challenge to the very timeline of civilization. If cities stood in Antarctica before the ice, then history, as we understand it, is built on sand. Who were the architects of those silent ruins? And how much has been forgotten beneath the weight of ice and time? The journey does not end here. If the bottom of the world hides the oldest cities, then what might lie in the heart of its greatest jungle? Next, we turn to the Amazon and the expedition that vanished into the green, leaving behind whispers of a civilization that never should have existed. The jungle doesn't give up its secrets easily. It swallows them under layers of moss, vines, and silence. In 1925, British explorer Percy Fawcett vanished into that silence. He wasn't chasing gold or fame. He was searching for something he believed existed in the heart of the Amazon, a city he called Z. To many, Z was a fantasy, a myth whispered by indigenous tribes and half-remembered by colonial records. But Fawcett was convinced. His research uncovered old Portuguese documents describing vast cities with roads, irrigation, and populations in the hundreds of thousands, not scattered tribes, civilizations. His final expedition included his son Jack and a close companion, Raleigh Rimmel. They left behind detailed maps and messages transmitted via indigenous messengers. Then, nothing. No bodies, no wreckage, just the jungle, as impassive as ever. But not all was lost. Hidden in government vaults and private letters were pieces of what Fawcett found. Reports spoke of massive earthworks, patterns only visible from the sky. Fertile soil engineered with ancient techniques still baffling to modern science. Roads built with drainage systems. Buildings designed to survive floods. Metallurgical workshops producing alloys lighter than aluminum but stronger than steel. It wasn't just a lost city. It was a network, a forgotten society with science, art, and infrastructure. One that flourished and fell long before Columbus ever set sail. Why, then, has it taken so long for the world to acknowledge this? Part of the answer lies in colonial narratives. If the Amazon had once been home to advanced societies, the justification for conquest that these lands were uncivilized would unravel. The idea that indigenous people held deep scientific knowledge upends centuries of assumptions. Even today, areas described in Fawcett's notes remain inaccessible. Governments claim they're protecting indigenous communities or fragile ecosystems. But satellite imagery continues to reveal geometric shapes, roads, and city layouts beneath the canopy, echoing Fawcett's lost trail. His disappearance remains unsolved. Some say he died at the hands of hostile tribes. Others believe he chose to stay. But perhaps the real mystery isn't what happened to him. It's what he found. What if the jungle didn't consume him, but welcomed him? What if he stepped into the ruins of Z and simply never wanted to leave? As we leave the green depths behind, our journey turns toward ancient monasteries in the high, cold breath of the Himalayas, and manuscripts that describe knowledge not yet known to science. The air in the Himalayas is thin, not just in oxygen, but in noise, distraction, and time. In 1924, Russian explorer Nicholas Roerich led an expedition across Central Asia and into the secluded monasteries of Tibet. What he found wasn't just art or prayer. It was knowledge, ancient, technical, and unsettling in its precision. Officially, Roerich was there for cultural research. But Soviet records suggest a deeper purpose: the search for star knowledge. Monks had spoken of ancient manuscripts, texts preserved for millennia, said to contain wisdom passed down from civilizations predating recorded history. Roerich's team found those manuscripts buried in hidden libraries, written in forgotten scripts. What they contained defied the imagination. Diagrams of machines that could generate energy without fuel, blueprints for devices that could control weather, charts predicting the position of planets and stars with a precision that matched, and sometimes exceeded, the best instruments of the 20th century. And then there were the prophecies, visions of future technologies described with eerie accuracy, vehicles that moved without animals, voices carried across great distances, power harnessed from the sky, all detailed in manuscripts thousands of years old. The deeper Roerich went, the more incredible the discoveries. But back in Moscow, alarm bells were ringing. The information, if real, could change everything. So the texts were confiscated. The team silenced, the findings classified. Soviet scientists pored over the material, hoping for military applications. But much of it remained beyond their reach. Blueprints for technologies that required materials or principles not yet discovered. And then silence. Roerich lived out his days as an artist and mystic, but rarely spoke of what he'd seen. Requests from international scholars to view the manuscripts have been consistently denied. The excuse? Religious sensitivity. But those who've seen Roerich's notes speak of references to global disasters, lost civilizations that mastered space travel, and energy systems that could power the world or destroy it. To this day, the full contents of those Tibetan manuscripts remain sealed. What if knowledge doesn't always rise from ignorance, but sometimes falls, forgotten, buried, protected? From sacred scrolls in mountain sanctuaries, we now follow another trail, this time into the desert sands of Mongolia, where one expedition went looking for fossils and found something far older than bones. In the windswept vastness of the Gobi Desert, 1922, American explorer Roy Chapman Andrews led an expedition to uncover the bones of Earth's ancient creatures. He expected fossils. What he found instead threatened to rewrite the story of human civilization. The Gobi, ancient and silent, yielded more than just the remains of dinosaurs. Team geologist Walter Granger uncovered metallic artifacts embedded in stone dated millions of years old, precision-machined objects etched with patterns too perfect for nature and too complex for primitive tools. Devices that resembled instruments of observation, perhaps for the stars, perhaps for the Earth. Their existence defied explanation. Then came the discovery that would haunt the team, what appeared to be an ancient laboratory. Carved into solid rock, its chambers contained remnants of tools, instruments, even symbols carved along the walls. Mathematical, astronomical, and undeniably purposeful. It was as if the desert had preserved the workshop of a civilization no one remembered. Carbon dating of organic material placed the site's origins in an impossible era, long before Homo sapiens. Yet the metallurgy and engineering surpassed anything achievable even in the early 20th century. The contradiction was too much for the institutions of the day to absorb. The moment Andrews and his team reported their findings, a curtain dropped. Officials from several countries intervened. The site was sealed. Reports were rewritten. The team was ordered into silence. Later satellite imagery would reveal strange geometric patterns hidden beneath the desert's skin, outlines of structures, roads, perhaps cities. But efforts to investigate have been blocked, citing preservation and security concerns. Andrews, once a rising star of exploration, spoke less and less of his findings. Publicly, he continued to discuss fossilized eggs and bones. Privately, he never again returned to that hidden site in the desert. What kind of civilization could have thrived in a time we believe was void of humanity? Could the Gobi have been home not to early humans, but to something entirely different? Our journey presses forward now into another frozen frontier, the Arctic, where in 1913 another explorer found warmth buried in ice and a different kind of silence waiting. The Arctic is a place of extremes, brutal cold, endless light, endless dark. But in 1913, Canadian explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson found something that didn't belong there: warmth, design, and memory. His team was charting unclaimed stretches of the north when they came upon structures half buried in permafrost. Not igloos, not primitive shelters, but buildings, engineered to endure the cold using principles unknown to modern Arctic construction. Thick walls without visible seams. Rooms that remained warm, though no fire had touched them in centuries. At the heart of these ruins, Stephenson's team found instruments. Devices capable of tracking stars and planets, predicting eclipses, and calculating astronomical cycles with uncanny accuracy. The tools, preserved in ice, were made of metals unknown to science, alloys that remained sharp and functional, impervious to corrosion and age. And then there were the carvings, libraries in a sense, etched into the ice itself. Symbols unlike any known language, yet carrying the weight of logic, mathematics, and something deeper: technical instruction. One map showed global geography with a precision far beyond the era. It marked not only the Arctic coastlines, but regions in the southern hemisphere that would not be charted for decades. The implications were staggering. These people had known the world and possibly traveled it. The Canadian government's response was swift. The documents and artifacts were seized. The region was restricted. Stephenson's access was revoked. His future expeditions were redirected toward safer, simpler missions. Today, as Arctic ice continues to melt, strange shapes emerge from the thaw: stone outlines, metal glints, anomalies dismissed as natural formations. But the resemblance to Stephenson's descriptions is striking. Some truths are not hidden. They are frozen, waiting. Not erased, only paused. If the Arctic held a civilization equipped for the harshest conditions, what does that say about the resilience and reach of human ingenuity? From the icy veil of the north, we journey now to the boundless Pacific, where in 1947 a raft drifted into history and encountered secrets far older than sail. It began as an experiment, a raft lashed together with rope and determination, drifting across the Pacific. In 1947, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl set out on the Kon-Tiki to prove that ancient South Americans could have reached Polynesia using primitive boats. But what the expedition uncovered was not just possibility, it was memory. As Heyerdahl's team crossed vast ocean stretches, they encountered islanders who spoke of ancient visitors, skyboats, and ships that moved beneath the sea. Oral traditions held startling precision. Stories of trade routes, celestial navigation, and shared ancestry spanning thousands of miles. Not legend, knowledge. On remote islands, the team found tools and artifacts that shouldn't have been there. Instruments for reading the stars, calculating distances, and predicting tides, requiring a level of mathematical and astronomical understanding far ahead of the presumed capabilities of prehistoric peoples. There were structures too, megaliths on windswept shores, stonework that resisted time and tsunami alike, massive blocks positioned with engineering foresight, earthquake-resistant layouts, and patterns that aligned with solstices and celestial events. Some of these islands were considered uninhabited, yet they bore the fingerprints of vanished architects. Evidence of ancient mining operations also surfaced. quarries that had extracted rare minerals, remnants of trade in metals that suggested an organized economy, not scattered survival. When Heyerdahl attempted to publish these findings, particularly those hinting at advanced prehistoric maritime civilizations, the resistance was immediate. Academic institutions rejected his theories. Funding dried up. Follow-up expeditions were denied permits. It was as if the ocean had to remain a barrier, not a bridge. And yet, modern oceanographic surveys continued to reveal anomalies, submerged structures, ancient harbors, and pathways etched into seabeds. The Pacific, it seems, remembers. What if the sea was never a limit, but a highway? What if ancient peoples knew the currents better than we know highways today? From islands adrift in myth, we now turn toward the sands of Africa, where beneath the Sahara, cities lie buried, and art remembers the sky. The Sahara was not always a desert. Once it bloomed with life. Rivers ran, forests stood, and civilizations flourished. In 1933, French archaeologist Henri Lotte ventured into the Tassili-Niger region of the Central Sahara to study prehistoric rock art. What he found was not merely artistic, it was technological. Etched into stone were images that defied categorization, figures clad in what appeared to be suits, operating machinery with levers and panels. Others showed objects that resembled aircraft, complete with aerodynamic shapes and propulsion systems unknown to the ancient world. These weren't mythic symbols, they were designs. Deeper into the dunes, Lotte's team discovered the remains of urban centers, multi-story buildings with precise stonework, complex layouts, and signs of manufacturing. Irrigation systems wound through the ruins, channeling water with hydraulic engineering that could rival modern desert agriculture. Tools and metallic artifacts lay buried in the sand. The metals were unlike anything cataloged, and their composition resisted explanation. Their surfaces bore no sign of corrosion, as if they had been forged not just for function, but endurance. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of the discovery was the sense of order, a knowledge of the environment and a mastery of it. These ancient people had not merely survived the desert, they had shaped it. The response from French colonial authorities was swift and absolute. Reports were suppressed. Artifacts vanished into private collections or government vaults. Lotte was allowed to publish only the least controversial of his findings. His more provocative evidence was classified, never to see public light. Today, satellite imagery shows ghostly grids beneath the sands, buried avenues, collapsed structures, signs of cities lost not to time, but to silence. Why would such a legacy be hidden? Because if Africa held advanced civilizations long before Europe's rise, then the narrative of cultural superiority falters. If the Sahara once cradled science and structure, then conquest becomes not a mission of progress, but a theft of memory. Next, we climb toward the clouds again, to the Himalayas, where a different kind of technology once hummed inside stone walls, and gravity may not have always been a constant. The Himalayas have always stood apart, a wall between worlds, a threshold between the earthly and the divine. In 1938, German explorer Ernst Schaefer led an expedition into Tibet, ostensibly to study wildlife and culture. But his true mission, driven by whispered legends and secretive funding, was to uncover something far stranger: remnants of a forgotten technology, hidden in the heights. In secluded monasteries, Schaefer's team was granted rare access to chambers few outsiders had ever seen. What they encountered there challenged the very laws of physics. Devices, small, elegant, and unassuming, floated in mid-air, untethered by any visible force. Stones levitated, objects hummed with silent energy. And monks, with calm precision, demonstrated the unthinkable, machines that responded not to touch, but to thought. These were not tricks or illusions. They were technologies operating by principles modern science could not explain, manipulating gravity, bending electromagnetic fields, and drawing power from unknown sources. Detailed diagrams carved into stone walls describe their workings with mathematical fluency far beyond known Tibetan history. Equations that looked like quantum mechanics, schematics that hinted at consciousness as an operating system. But Schaefer's discoveries sparked more than wonder. They triggered a geopolitical scramble. Nazi and Allied intelligence agencies both sought control over what had been found. Competing teams were dispatched. Covert skirmishes unfolded in the shadows of the mountains. Artifacts were seized. Some were destroyed. Others vanished into the archives of rival powers. The monks, sensing what was at stake, enacted a final safeguard. Many of the remaining technologies were hidden again, some dismantled, others entombed in unreachable sanctuaries. The knowledge was not to be weaponized. After the war, efforts to recover the lost devices were halted by shifting borders and tightened control. Today, access to the region's deepest secrets is strictly prohibited. The advanced machines, if they still exist, remain sealed away, out of reach, out of time. What if the ancients didn't just understand the universe? What if they interacted with it directly? What if awareness itself was once a source of energy? As we descend from the mountains, our path leads to another ancient land, vast, dry, and misunderstood. In the red heart of Australia, the ground remembers stories science has yet to hear. Australia's outback is a landscape of extremes, endless red earth, jagged rock, and skies that stretch to the edge of time. In 1931, British archaeologist Grafton Elliott Smith led an expedition deep into this ancient land. What he uncovered wasn't just archaeology. It was evidence of a scientific legacy written not in textbooks, but in stone. The team ventured to Aboriginal sites long dismissed as primitive. But the carvings in rock art told a different story. Star maps etched with uncanny accuracy. Constellations rendered in mathematically correct proportions. Planetary movements recorded with a precision that modern astronomers could admire. Some charts predicted celestial events thousands of years into the future and still hold true. Smith's team also found geological surveys cut into stone, maps of underground water systems, mineral deposits, and fault lines. These weren't guesses. They were observations born of empirical study, using methods that defied the tools presumed to exist at the time. Guided by Aboriginal elders, the expedition witnessed navigation techniques that used sun, wind, landscape, and memory, precise enough to traverse hundreds of miles without error. And there were signs of mining, not recent, but ancient. Ore had been extracted with skill. Metals refined, using knowledge that science hadn't attributed to indigenous Australians. But the most powerful revelations came not from artifacts, but from stories. Aboriginal oral traditions held generations of environmental knowledge, sustainable agricultural practices, and deep ecological insight. These weren't myths, they were repositories of science, passed down in song and ceremony, wrapped in culture, and resilient through time. Yet when Smith attempted to publish his findings, resistance came swiftly. Colonial authorities, still invested in the narrative of European superiority, suppressed the work. Academic journals refused to endorse theories that credited indigenous populations with scientific advancement. Smith, once celebrated, found himself silenced. Today, much of the knowledge he documented remains protected by Aboriginal communities, shielded from outsiders by necessity, not secrecy. Government restrictions, framed as cultural preservation, limit access to sites that may still hold clues to this forgotten science. What if wisdom isn't always written, but sung? What if the greatest libraries are held not in buildings, but in memory? From the Australian sands, we journey now to a stone temple in the jungles of Mesoamerica, and a tomb whose contents challenged everything archaeology dared to believe. Deep in the jungles of southern Mexico, the Temple of the Inscriptions rises like a forgotten monument to precision, silence, and time. In 1952, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Luillier uncovered the tomb of Pakal the Great, a Maya ruler buried with reverence and mystery. But beneath the stone lid, among relics and carvings, were objects that defied categorization and threatened the boundaries of historical orthodoxy. At first glance, the tomb was remarkable for its scale and artistry. But as Roerrich's team cataloged the artifacts, patterns began to emerge. Precision-machined components, gears, lenses, and alloys that resisted corrosion, items that looked more like mechanical parts than ritual offerings. The most striking object resembled a complex celestial calculator. It bore rotating discs, etched with symbols and numerical codes, and appeared to track lunar cycles, planetary alignments, and eclipses with startling accuracy. The device predated European astronomical clocks by centuries and exceeded them in some ways. Energy sources, too, were found. Sealed vessels that emitted low-level heat, their purpose unknown. No wiring, no fuel, just a slow, steady hum of something beyond the reach of 20th century understanding. And then there were the inscriptions, not myths, but instructions, diagrams and formulas embedded into the walls of hidden chambers. Equations that touched on harmonic resonance, spatial geometry, and forces unnamed by modern science. The tomb, it seemed, wasn't just a resting place. It was a vault of knowledge. But that knowledge was short-lived in the public eye. Before international scholars could study the artifacts in depth, many of them were removed by Mexican authorities, declared too fragile, too sacred, too sensitive. The official narrative shifted. Pacal's tomb was historical, ceremonial, nothing more. The more complex elements were quietly dismissed or ignored. Academic pressure mounted to downplay any suggestion of advanced technology. Maya civilization, they insisted, was brilliant, but bounded by stone tools, shrools, and ritual astronomy. Anything more was uncomfortable. Yet fragments of Roerrich's notes hint at something greater, a civilization that didn't just chart the cosmos, but interacted with it. A people who saw the sky not as a mystery, but as a mechanism. If they reached this level of understanding, what happened to it? What caused it to vanish? Or perhaps more precisely, who chose to bury it? As we leave the jungle, we find ourselves looking across all these stories, all these buried truths. One final chapter remains, a gathering of fragments into a single question that has no easy answer. Across every continent, the pattern repeats. Explorers step beyond the known, and what they find cannot be explained, or worse, must not be. These are not tales of isolated anomalies, but of a thread that runs through time, connecting deserts, ice, jungle, and mountain. Each expedition sought understanding. Instead, they found the edges of something larger, remnants of civilizations that possess knowledge long before our textbooks begin. Technologies that operated on forgotten principles. Maps of the stars carved into stone, machines built without modern tools, power sources that hummed in silence, and stories, always stories, passed down in memory, not manuscripts. What unites these lost discoveries isn't just their wonder, but their suppression. Photographs vanish. Artifacts disappear. Sites are sealed. Researchers are silenced. Again and again, the same refrain. Too controversial, too dangerous, too disruptive. But disruptive to what? To a narrative, perhaps, a version of history built not solely on evidence, but on convenience. One that favors certain timelines, certain cultures, certain hierarchies of intelligence. A version where advancement follows a single, linear path, ours. These expeditions challenge that comfort. They suggest the possibility of forgotten chapters. That knowledge is not cumulative, but cyclical. That civilizations rise, achieve marvels, and fall, leaving behind only whispers in stone, in sand, in story. And so the question becomes, are we the first to stand at the edge of technological wonder? Or are we merely the latest? In the silence that followed each discovery, in the blank pages where these findings should be, there is a deeper truth. not just about science or history, but about fear. Fear of what it would mean if we are not the pinnacle, but the echo. As we prepare to close this journey, one final chapter remains, a reflection not on what was found, but on what it means to seek, to forget, and perhaps one day to remember. Every lost expedition leaves behind more than unanswered questions. It leaves a presence, like a voice caught in the walls of time, waiting to be heard again. What these explorers uncovered may never appear in school books or museums, but their discoveries linger in the margins, haunting the silence. They remind us that knowledge is not a ladder we steadily climb, but a tide, rising, receding, sometimes lost entirely. Perhaps humanity has reached great heights before, only to fall, to forget, to begin again. The artifacts buried in ice and sand, the symbols etched into stone, the myths passed from elder to child, all echo with the same quiet insistence. We have been here before. And still the question remains, why suppress it? Some argue it's to protect fragile beliefs. Others suggest it's about control, of history, of narrative, of power. But perhaps at the core, it's something more human. A reluctance to face the vastness of what we do not know. A discomfort with the idea that our ancestors may have touched truths we have only begun to imagine. In each case, the response has been the same. Not investigation, not integration, but silence. Yet silence is not the same as absence. Modern science, with all its instruments and data, is slowly confirming what these explorers glimpsed. Satellite images of lost cities, soil analyses revealing engineered agriculture, strange materials unearthed from ancient layers. It's there, still waiting. Maybe one day, when we are less afraid of what it means to be wrong, we will look again with open eyes. Not to romanticize the past, but to understand it, to honor the depth and complexity of human history. To see not just the rise of civilization, but its recurrence. The explorers we've followed weren't searching for lost technology. They were searching for meaning. And in their search, they became part of a story far older than themselves, a story written in stone, buried in ice, whispered in wind. Now, in the final part of this journey, we gather these threads and ask not what was found, but what we do with the knowing. So where does it leave us? 14 stories, 10 expeditions, countless questions. We've followed footsteps across frozen continents and through whispering forests. We've listened to explorers who saw too much, who found what they weren't meant to, and paid for it with silence. Each chapter has opened a door, not into fantasy, but into possibility. Not to disprove our history, but to deepen it. Because perhaps the greatest mistake we make is to believe that the past is fully known, that discovery ends when something is cataloged or dated. But the world is older than our memory. And history, real history, is not a straight path, but a labyrinth. Maybe civilizations did rise before us, with their own sciences, philosophies, and ways of understanding the universe. Maybe they left behind seeds, fragments, echoes. And maybe those echoes have been heard, only to be buried again. Why? Sometimes the reasons are political, sometimes cultural, often simply fear. Because what we choose to believe about the past shapes how we live in the present and what we dare to imagine for the future. But there is another way, to ask with openness, to wonder with humility, to follow the clues not with certainty but with care, to see these stories not as threats but as invitations, to rethink, to relearn, to reconnect with the immense complexity of human potential. The explorers we've met did not set out to cause disruption. They followed curiosity. They listened to elders, to ancient maps, to forgotten stories. And in doing so, they brushed up against something astonishing and deeply human. Perhaps the real discovery is not in what they found, but in what it awakens in us. A hunger to look deeper, a willingness to let go of easy answers, and a reverence for the idea that knowledge, true knowledge, is never lost. It only waits. Somewhere, beneath ice and sand and time, it still breathes, and it is listening.